Welcome to the world's largest commercially operating civilian hovercraft. Today I invite you into the fascinating world of its features and the development of what is nicknamed the Mountbatten class hovercraft. This craft single-handedly moved thousands of travellers across the greatest of nations, Britain and France, in one of the coolest and fastest ways possible for its time. This is the story of the SRN-4. The SRN story starts in the mid-1960s, where Saunders, Roe and Vickers, both British aerospace and nautical development companies, had been approached by the NRDC to help develop a new type of craft. The craft crossing the boundaries between ship and aircraft would prompt the government-backed merger which had formed the British Hovercraft Corporation. The BHC would go on to create a number of crafts with the similar name of SRN followed by a number. SRN in fact stood for Saunders Roe Nautical, which would mean the company's name would forever go down in history as one of the main British manufacturers of a hovercraft. While the BHC was actually in development, the Minister of Technology at the time, Frank Cousins, was looking for a new way of making travel from Dover to Calais much quicker and smoother. Seeing the capabilities of the hovercraft, he would later announce that the British Rail would participate in the development of the SRN-4. Although other operators had already placed orders, British Rail would take delivery of the first two crafts. This would actually prove beneficial as the first buyers specifically specified in their contracts that they would not take delivery of the first two production crafts. This was quite a common practice when investing in new technologies, as you wouldn't want to be the buyer that had all the issues. By November 1967, the first craft had been built, and after an 11-week-long test run, on land of course, the first few faults had been exposed and rectified. And by February 1968, the first water test had been completed, and while it had been marked as successful, it highlighted that the landing areas were far too small and hard to manoeuvre, something that wasn't foreseen in the past. The SRN-4 wasn't the first craft that had been developed, as other smaller crafts came first, such as the SRN-5 and the SRN-6. Although a numbering scheme wasn't in order, it was much easier to develop something smaller for testing in non-civilian uses, not to mention the hovercraft was still relatively new and using a much smaller and easier to build testbed was much cheaper. Later that same day in February 1968, the SRN-4 Mark I had set off on its maiden voyage, after of which a few minor modifications had to be made to avoid salt water from entering the air intakes. It was a success nonetheless. The capacity of the SRN-4 Mark I was 254 passengers, 30 cars to the top speed of 83 knots, but this would mostly cruise at only 60 knots. The craft would weigh 193 tonnes and was 40 metres in length. And when you think about it, 40 metres, 193 tonne craft without wings seems impossible, so it must have taken some serious engine power, and these engines were seriously powerful. The hovercraft was powered by 4 Rolls-Royce Marine Proteus gas turbine engines, which was used for both lift and propulsion. These engines could produce 3,700 horsepower at the propeller. The propulsion propellers were about 5.8 metres in diameter, about the length of a Ford Ranger, and were placed high above the craft where they were capable of moving side to side for manoeuvring. The hovercraft would hold 8,000 imperial gallons of fuel, and the engines would consume 1,000 imperial gallons of fuel per hour when cruising at 50 knots, meaning refuelling was required every 150 miles or so. Hovering is thirsty work. The SRN-4 also had a 12-tonne rubber skirt with 5 large feet for the craft to rest on in its downtime. These had amusingly been called elephant feet, which actually reminds me of another fascination of mine. The craft had 2 very comfortable passenger cabins located either side of the craft, which would feature large comfortable seats, adequate legroom and a bar to provide the essential champagne and cigarettes. The cockpit was located on top of the craft, which would allow for maximum visibility. The cockpit was very much like aircraft cockpits of the time, meaning it was cramped, small and just enough room for the 3-person crew. The 3-person crew consisted of the captain, the first officer and the second officer. As you will be fully aware that the weather and the sea go hand in hand like anything, and the SRN-4 Mark I could withstand and operate into up to gale force 8 winds, which is roughly around 34 to 40 knots, and fairly rough seas of swells up to 3.5 metres, but later on we'll explain how that might not be strictly true. In 1969 there were 2 main operators for the SRN-4, this being a company called Hover Lloyd and another called Hover Speed. Both these companies had operated smaller hovercrafts for the cross-channel journey, but saw a vast potential in utilising a larger craft. On expressing interest in operating the larger SRN-4, Hoverloid were to create the first purpose-built commercial hoverport in Ramsgate with the SRN-4 in mind. This new port would allow easy, smooth, comfortable travel straight across the channel, just as the Minister of Technologies wanted at the time. By 1972, a few SRN-4 hovercrafts had been taken out of service to convert them into the Mark II. The Mark II upgrade would allow for 7 more car spaces and 28 more passenger seats. This was done by redesigning the interior, a newer design to create a more affluent interior and making it feel like you are really travelling in first class style. Following the success of the Mark II and the passenger numbers forever increasing, 2 Mark IIs were taken out of service and redesigned to form the Mark III, the much larger commercially operating civilian hovercraft. Unlike the Mark II, where the redesign was all interior based and never affected the exterior, the Mark III would quite literally be chopped in half and extended. The Mark III upgrades would quite literally double the capacity at 418 passengers, 60 cars and weighing in at a whopping 320 tonnes. Its length had been extended from 40 metres to 56 metres and could reach the maximum speed of 70 knots. And with these upgrades, the travel time between Dover and Calais wasn't shortened, it still remained at 35 minutes. And in fact, in September 1995, it performed the fastest hovercraft crossing across the channel, which was 22 minutes. That is impressive. Travelling by hovercraft is relatively risk-free, where most incidents at sea would just mean the hovercraft was simply towed back to port and no harm done. This was until March 1985, where 4 passengers had lost their lives when the Princess Margaret crashed into the pier entrance at Dover Harbour. This gale force 6 storm had forced the craft into the side of the pier, which tore open the side of the craft, quite literally throwing the passengers into the sea. This would make it a significant risk when travelling in storms. As mentioned earlier on, it was meant to be rated up to gale force 8. This wouldn't be the only major incident the SRN-4 would have, where in February 2000 the Princess Anne left Calais for Dover. The winds at departure were 25 knots. On receiving information that the local wind speed had increased to 42 knots, the captain had decided that this would be the last trip until the weather had improved. He informed Dover Base 1 of his decision, and after confirming that the conditions were still within operational limits, he continued on to Dover. Midway through this journey, the hovercraft would dip into a wave, resulting in a minor impact on the port forward side of the craft. This would result in 3 passenger windows being smashed open, but no injuries had been sustained, just a very wet, soggy passenger. As mentioned in my previous videos, the hovercraft went out of fashion due to the rising fuel costs and other cheaper forms of transportation across the channel. If you're curious about the beginnings of the hovercraft and where it all started, I really recommend my previous video, link down below. Anyway, I hope you have enjoyed this video. Please give me a subscribe. Bye for now.